We've got Frank Duff with us. I think I was telling somebody, right before you joined, Frank, I think you are probably the person I will ever talk to in my life that knows the most about MITRE ATT&CK, like, through and through. So super, super happy to have you with us today.
Oh, absolutely. Thrilled to be here. So always glad to talk about attack and the trials and tribulations of that journey since before it existed. So yeah. Yeah.
I bet. It's, we talk about attack all the time with folks. And in my mind, and I'm sure it means different things to different people, but in my mind, it's the biggest indicator of our industry as a whole maturing and going and saying, hey, we can't just shoot from the hip for all these things. We need to start about like thinking it's not a science, clearly, but we
Yeah.
need to try to make it as close as we can, right? So yeah, that's
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if you think about where we came in that discussion, right? So I know somebody just posted my information, and feel free to look it up. But like, I was at MITRE for 20 years, and so the last half of those 20 years was all centered around what came to be attack. I was originally doing detection engineering, trying to figure out how to find bad guys that were on host before the EDR market even existed. And so we were rolling our own sensors, doing our own detections, doing our own hunts. And right when we started that work, it was really on that principle that you're saying. It's like we can't just be just like randomly trying to find vulnerabilities and randomly looking for IOCs and hashes and hoping that that's security. And instead, we had to have a different way of looking at it. And so, I mean, when it started as a research project on how to figure out could we find the bad guy post-exploit, turned into this thing that industry has taken on. And if you look at it now, I mean, it's just generally adopted and accepted. And so we went to long growing pains of like trying to get people to buy into the mentality of like, uh, look inside the network. You can't like the whole presumed breach, right? That wasn't a thing if you think about it. Like now it's common practice. But before it was like, no, we need to just have really high walls and hopefully everybody stays out. So it's been interesting to watch it evolve from just like concept, can we, to this is a thing, but now we need to get people to all buy into the mentality to then it's like now just an accepted practice and it's just the way of battling it. So yeah, absolutely.
it is. At the same time, it feels like there's still some work to do, right? Like I feel like we've got the oh my god, what's that word? Not the nomenclature, or the ontology, right?
Yeah.
Around all of that. And so I think we can talk about these things in a common way. But it feels to me, and tell me if you feel differently, but it feels like now the kind of the next step to bridge is to say, hey, we all agree on what this technique kind of is at a high level. Now there is some subtlety or some details about how do we go at actually detecting it. And I feel
Yeah.
like that part is still kind of under the iceberg. It's all a black box in most places. Yeah, do you feel the same
Yeah,
way?
no, I don't disagree with you, right? I think that Attack did a wonderful job of abstracting, but it's almost abstracted up too high, right? And so you saw like initially it was just techniques, and now they have sub techniques. Even on some sub techniques, I think it was they did some re-architecture on V17, the one that came out just a couple weeks ago, where now there's the DLL technique, and then underneath that they've got like a list of like 8 different ways that that could even be used. So in essence, sub techniques, if you will. So I think that you're absolutely right that there is a lot of nuance that is lacking. But as a communication mechanism, you almost need that abstraction. So you have to kind of understand what is the value of attack, but also what is the limitations. And that's one of the things that I'm will talk to in pretty much every talk I'm in. It's like recognize what attack is good at and what attack does, but recognize that it's not all of these things, right? The challenges of the detection engineering faces talking about what they're doing at a technique level lets them explain to leadership what they're doing. Is it going to tell them that this is exactly the detection I should write to address this threat? No, that's where it does currently lack and where you really need procedural level details. And I think that you're going to continue to see, hopefully, that gap between, like, if you think about the pyramid of pain, there's actually this gap in the pyramid of pain, right? It's that gap around the P in TTPs, right? Tactics, techniques, IOCs and all the lower part. We got that, but we need the Ps. And so I think you're going to see that gap in the pyramid start shrinking, right? It's not going to go to the level of IOCs. It's going to be something more robust than that, but it's going to be something that is more actionable than an attack technique is.
Gotcha. And so I think when you like when we spoke by writing briefly, you wanted to chat around the idea of of attack, not just from the perspective of like kind of the ground level of attack, but about how to evaluate risk
Yeah.
within the company. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, well, exactly. So thinking about again the attack strengths and as a communication mechanism, a lot of the people that need communication at a leadership level think in terms of risk. And so I think one of the interesting things, so to go back a step, when I left MITRE to go start Tidal, right, it was heavily because the actionability around attack just wasn't there. Right, I could test EDRs every year, multiple times a year, and it still wasn't answering the fundamental question of, am I protected as an organization, right? I wasn't helping drive that discussion forward. And as much as MITRE could, debatably, shouldn't, I don't know, say who wins, right? A win for one isn't the win for the other, right? Two organizations are too different. And so to get to that level of understanding, this is how I am doing as an organization, right? That is why at the end of the day, Tidal existed. But it's been interesting to see as I've gotten more and more experience dealing with the end user community around that, right? Talking about attack is great for practitioners, but it still needs to be raised up a level. So if we can talk about it in terms of risk, I think that that's what helps kind of finalize, really make it impactful for that C level to truly understand, oh, this is why we're making those investments in those tools. This is why we are or are not concerned about given threats, because now I'm really understanding that it's about risk. It's about realizing that it's not about a single behavior. It's about the collection of behaviors. It's about the fact that you're doing well on these ones, but poor on these other ones, where your gaps, where your strength, and looking at that as a unified picture, which really goes right hand in hand with risk, right? Because you're looking at what is the likelihood and what is the probability that threat actors are actually going to use behaviors, a specific behavior, the impact of that behavior, right? Those are risk terms, but it helps resonate and helps build the story around it so that, again, it's a figuring out how do we make attack more actionable. And for the C levels, you need it to be more of like related to the business, right? And that's, I think, where talking about it from a risk perspective really helps make some sense.
Interesting. I like that you talk about it as actionable, and usually in my world, what that means is at the technical level, make it actionable. But you're thinking actionable, no, at the high level, and that's
Yeah.
absolutely a valid definition of it. I love it.
Right. Well, that's what I mean. Think about where attack came from, right? Why did attack succeed, right? MITRE releases a lot of standards, as everybody knows. Some of those standards go into nothingness. Some of them are attack made the very purposeful thing of not being a standard. Instead, it was supposed to be a communication mechanism, but it was a communication mechanism. First and foremost, was like I was writing just random analytics, thinking that it would be suspicious things that are happening on a box, like oh, documents should never open from a PDF. So let's look at that type of chain, right? It's like taking stabs in the dark. Or nothing should ever access LSAS, right? Like that was a misconception that we had in the minute time. Now everything touches LSAS, so like yeah. But like we needed a way to first and foremost communicate with CTI so that we could actually drive on actual behaviors threats we're using. We needed a way to communicate with the assessors, the red team that was assessing our detections on that every other month basis. But more than anything, that's fun activity, that's useful activity. But unless you can talk about it to leadership who's funding you to do that activity, it's useless. So you need to communicate to leadership. You need to make CTI attack, all of these concepts more relatable. And that's where it's like actionable depending on how you action it, but it's more actionable for the decision makers to actually say, yes, the action I'm going to take is continue funding on this research for attack. Or the action I'm going to take is going to go and buy this tool or remove this tool or make tell my CIO that I need to make this change to my configuration, right? Like it can be actionable because now it has a broader sense of the risk because they don't need to know what every given cell on the attack matrix is, but they need to generally know where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, and why.
Right, right. Because so here's my, perhaps naive view of that, right? When I think about risk and you're talking about, making that actionable to the C-suite, and I combine that with MITRE, I think we're in a way we're kind of going back to the gap you were mentioning before, but the MITRE attack framework is going to describe like the TTPs roughly, that there's a gap between all the bad things that could happen and risk. and
Yeah.
and it feels like I guess my naive view of that would be that the thing that's in between is sort of the thing that's very organization specific, right? So
Right.
for an organization, let's say that, and I think we were chatting briefly earlier, that is starting to kind of pepper their infrastructure, their processes with these concepts of MITRE ATT&CK. How do they go then to like leverage that to really bridge the gap? Is it like a consulting thing? You know what I mean? Like a very
Yeah.
human process?
I think that traditionally that's the easiest way that it's been coming through, right? If you think about the Deloittes of the world or pick your big four, right? They do those attack assessments and that's helpful. But I think that the information's all there for organizations to really do it themselves, right? They just need to understand what is the value of the assets. What do they value? What do they have as like their main concern as an organization, right? Being able to identify that, you know what, I'm most concerned about ransomware and I'm worried about the exfil of PII, right? That will help scope down to the threats that matter to them, at least today. And they can kind of continue to monitor that. So now you're talking about good threat profiling concepts are now actionable because you understand what your threats are. And then from a business perspective, again, it's like understanding that, okay, well, I've got this type of Windows machines and my C levels use this version of a Mac OS and then I've got servers over here of this type, right? But you can map each of those out, measure their risk independently, measure their attack coverage independently, and boil that up. I think that it doesn't have to be a consulting role anymore to be able to get at that answer because you do have vendors that natively speak attack now, right? I mean, all the major vendors out there, if you ask them for an attack heat map, they can generate it. Different levels of specificity, whether you not want to believe it, who knows? But it's there to be had and to start with. And then CTI providers are all provided. So like again, the information's there. It just is like how do you fuse it together? And I don't think it has to be as hard as we make it.
And how do you feel is the best way, or is there a framework for bridging that gap between, if I'm somebody working at the tech level, let's say I'm the head of the SOC, right? And yes, I have all of these MITRE reports that tell me kind of the technical and the TTP side of things. I can probably make some educated guesses about the threat modeling, but it's not even the threat modeling; it's the importance of things to the business.
Right.
But I suspect that if I go in and I make that list of, hey, here's what I think is important to the business, the C-suite probably sees very different things. Different parts of the company sees different things. Is
Mhm.
there is there like a way to approach that process, you think?
That's interesting. I don't think that there's probably a silver bullet. It's going to be very dependent on what is the language and what is the level of sophistication that that C-suite speaks in, right? Like we talk to a lot of sophisticated CISOs, but we talk a lot with a lot of CISOs who think that they're sophisticated, and right, like you kind of have to kind of understand where they are. But at the end of the day, if you don't know how they're thinking about security and where they are prioritizing, right, you're kind of up against it. Like one of the things that I like to do, and I think about like doing attack assessments, is right. I come from doing that research project at MITRE that was looking at endpoint data. So I come in very biased towards endpoint telemetry, and especially EDR telemetry, given evals and all that stuff. But for organizations that want to, that maybe aren't far along that journey and don't have detection engineers and don't really have capacity to use it, right? It's like, all right, well, then maybe building that wall higher is okay So you have to understand from your C level that that is the strategy you guys are doing. Make it a purposeful strategy, understand the limitations of that strategy. But that's again where attack can help expand on that. So if you're that technical expert, you're that SOC manager, you're trying to do that translation, say, okay, well, that is what your strategy is. This is how we're doing. We're doing all right as if we're looking at through the lens of that strategy, but here's where that strategy is going to fail us. And so we're going to accept that risk, or we have to change things. But it allows you to have that very conscious decision around, is it something worth changing, or is it something that I'm just going to go with?
Interesting. Uh, do you think so? You kind of touched a couple of times on like EDR evals, right? Being like it's almost the inception point of where MITRE ATT&CK becomes a real thing. Um, is there like do people build their own attack frameworks not from EDR vendors and not from vendors at all? Like, hey, we put, this
Yeah, absolutely.
policy
Yeah.
in
So a few different dimensions of that. So one, I would say like the first step of things is I really try to look at it as I relate it back to something I saw. There used to be a yearly study on like how SIM doesn't cover attack, right? And it's like that is the exact example of what is wrong with attack coverage. And EDRs do it too, right? EDRs would try to claim 100% coverage. And it's like that is the wrong perspective. There's certain things they're going to be strong at, certain things they're going to be weak at, and it's about having a healthy dose of reality with that. And so I've had a lot of success talking with vendors over the last however many years and getting them to realize that and own up to the fact that, we don't do all the things and we don't do all the things in all the ways, right? We don't cover every procedure, but being more forthright about what they do and how they do and like whether it's spot policy. So that's the first part of the problem is just making vendors speak the language. Then the second part is how do you actually analyze it? So there are people out there that will create their own organic attack mappings based off of their own data, right? Things that they see, their observables. And if you've got a healthy testing program, that might be a smart way of doing it, right? If you've got, I mean, I don't want to say just BAS, but BAS plus atomic testing plus red teaming, right? You can build a pretty good picture of what your quote unquote coverage is from actuality. But there's no doubt that most organizations can't do that. And so what they are is at the they're unfortunately controlled by whatever a vendor says to them. And so that's where I think the important part is trying to figure out how do we ease communications between vendors and end users. Because if you just talk to the vendor, right, like I'll relate back again to another evals thing, right? The vendors would come in with specialized rule sets that would be for attack only. Now the end user only sees the result in that 100% coverage. But like we did go to the point about being able to say, hey, vendors, you have to disclose that you did that. Unfortunately, nobody reads the fine print. So we have to kind of get better as a community about understanding how the vendor covers versus just that they do cover. And I think, right, that goes to the whole attack as a bingo thing that's out there on InfoSec Twitter or whatever you're calling it now, and those types of things. So get away from those and focus on the how they cover. Recognize that they might have broad coverage, but it might not be the same coverage that you actually have. So I know that kind of goes in a few different directions on what your question was. Um, but it unfortunately comes full circle where it's like, yeah, you kind of have to just know what your coverage is at the end of the day. And you either have to build that organically, most organizations can't. So then it's about, okay, let's hear what the vendor has to say, understand how, and then understand, does that apply to us? And then if you can validate it, great. But at least you've got a little bit sense of reality into what the details are there.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, I think it's the inevitable outcome that, as you try to define the thing, it's like compliance, right? People will, I won't say game it, that's perhaps a negative view
Right.
on it, but they'll, you
Well,
know,
there's so much. I mean, not to go into evals, but right, there's so much money involved in evals, right? With in
exactly.
terms of the research that these EDRs do ahead of time to prepare for it, the ability to say that they won versus their competitors, right? I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean, there's a reason why I'm not doing it anymore. It's like testing did not become fun anymore. The first few years, it was very fun because it was focused on driving the industry forward, right? Like the first set of evals, it's like, all right. we know that process information is really important to capture, like not just process, but command line. And unfortunately, there were a number of solutions out there that were just like doing like at best, like, okay, well, command.exe ran. It's like, all right, it ran what? Right. And so our first step was just to kind of build a baseline, right? That was what APT3 was. APT 29 was very much centered on, okay, I want to, we know that PowerShell is the next thing that's coming on. Like everybody started using PowerShell, right? And this was probably 2021-ish kind of time frame, if I remember correctly, sometime around there, right? So PowerShell's just on the uptick, but censoring is garbage on PowerShell. And so we wanted to kind of prove that point. And so APT 29 was to kind of like, hey, you guys aren't collecting the right data, and we did that. And then the next round, we were to say, okay, well, let's show the improvements people have made on that. And right, so we would do some of the PowerShell stuff again and say, yeah, people are now making sense of PowerShell, but let's try some WMI data on the side, and right, like let's put a part there. So evals originally started as let's make incremental growth, and I think it served that point. But testing is hard. It's an unenviable task, but it's also necessary, right? Because somebody has to keep somebody honest, and I got to credit that MITRE does continue to try to do the good work. It's not for the faint of heart, but it is what it is.
Yeah, it's so it's one of the few things that we can kind of put an envelope around, right? And we go
Yeah.
like, look, this technique, like we can test for that thing.
Yeah.
There's a ton of other things in security at large that we should consider, but like, trying to put an envelope on that is really brutal.
Yeah, yeah, trying to get like into like I remember everybody always wants us to like evaluate noise, and they're doing some of that now. So credit to them of like the false positives. But like right there's the false positives, but then like there's like, okay, do you even have the maturity? Right? Like that's where I really like what like the immersive labs or guys are doing and stuff like that. It's like measuring the performance of your, like, if you're doing Splunk training, right, that those mappings mean a lot more to you than if you haven't done the Splunk training before, right? And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot of interesting dimensions that get into the people aspects and the usability of the data aspects and those types of things, well beyond just can you cover X, from a technique perspective.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So where do you see that approach? And when I say that approach, I really mean it like pretty wide. Like I think the formalization of things in cybersecurity would be the that I would describe it. Where do you see that going? Is there aspects of that that you want to push for? I won't say adoption because
Yeah, yeah.
it's that can be hard, but try to encourage.
So, I mean, I don't know if, I mean, they're not groundbreaking ideas, but I would just say, like, again, I mean, I've worked with attack as long as I have because I do believe in attack. But beyond attack, I believe in threat informed defense at large, right? So focusing on the threat. And so if I look at that, the two really big things that have been happening the last few years that I want to hopefully see continue to grow and not end up in a bad place like SOAR and everything else did in that vein. But like what I want to see is like CTEM as a market, right? So Gartner calls it CTEM, so continual threat exposure management. Now, I do think that it's relatively limited in focusing at vulnerabilities right now. And so obviously looking more at attack behaviors is really important. There's a lot of cluttering around, right? It's what do they call it? It's kind of like a framework. It's not a product segment, so it's not like EDR. But because of that, like everybody claims that they are CTEM, but it's like a philosophy, but I do think that the philosophy as a whole is a good movement forward, right? To connect okay, how does attack surface management and breach attack simulation and threat intelligence and SOC optimization, how does all of that come into play in a life cycle? So I do like CTEM, and hopefully that continues to kind of move forward. And then the other aspect is I was really happy to see this stuff that's come out in the EU around DORA. I won't claim to be a DORA expert, but right, the whole premise around DORA is that every organization is expected to be understanding their risk and resilience post breach. So being able to recognize that there is this life beyond the wall that you have to kind of do, and you have to validate it. whether that means BAS, whether that means not just doing a pen test, but actually doing a red team in addition to a pen test, right? There's a lot of ways that that could be achieved. But I think like those types of things to make people realize that like they have to be doing these other things, they have to understand it's not just about having an EDR, it's about knowing that you've configured it right and that you are using it right, or you are outsourcing your support, like your MDR or MSSP, to use it right for you, right? Like, but they're good concepts to have, right? Be threat informed, acknowledge that vulnerabilities are going to happen, especially in the world of AI, where like initial access is going to become easier and easier and easier in some aspects, right? You need to have that resiliency throughout your entire defensive ecosystem. So I think those are the two things that aren't necessarily new, but are newer that I think really I want to see continue to take hold.
Very cool, very cool. I wonder if there's also room, and I think it might have been sort of partially covered by what you mentioned, but room for um, extending, I guess it's like measurable metrics
Mm,
around certain types of activity around the SOC, right? Like
yeah.
around measuring, hey, maybe it does go into the TTPs from attack, but being able to say, how is my SOC responding to
Absolutely.
like typical ransomware like this TTP? And that, I feel like if you sat down and tried to put a little bit of a framework around that, there would be some really interesting measurables around that.
100%. I think that's super interesting, especially if you figure out how to get not just get the measurables, but if we figure out as a community how to start sharing some of the measurables about what works and what doesn't work around processes, that would be super powerful. I was talking with a company out of Pittsburgh the other day that has a company that does a lot of these. Let's go back, do postmortems on what happened. Let's figure out where the process worked, where it doesn't work. And right, like the data that they've got to see is like super interesting, I feel like to be able to understand, okay, this is the common place where we see companies failing is by this reason. And maybe it's an over dependency on EDR or something like that. I don't know. But like I think that would be really fascinating to get more and more metrics around that. I know that Ali over at Forrester has done a lot of good work also around trying to measure performance through the various tiers and kind of advocating for how to look across some of those. I won't be an expert on what she says either, but I'll definitely refer people to definitely look at some of the work she's done because she's got very heavy SOC focus and how to translate those analysts' workflows.
Very cool, very cool. Yeah, these are the types of things that make me hopeful. I think I haven't been quite as long in the industry as you. I started around 2007, but I can also feel that, we're slowly building up that formality, not formality, but the structure around what we're doing. And I kind
It's
of
structure,
dream.
exactly. That's a good way of looking at it. It's about structure and right. I mean, cyber. You got right into cyber for what it's worth around the same time I did. I'm not that old
Okay.
yet, but yeah, but yeah, no, I completely get it. It is. It's good to see the structure around it. It's good to see. I mean, there's fewer and fewer conversations we have around why is attack important? Why does attack exist? And I think that that tells us a lot, right? People are understanding communication is really important, and right, that's why it was succeeded. That's why it was a grassroots movement in the industry, was because it enabled communication. It was a framework to talk about things. And right now, you're seeing all these attack for X's spin out, and right, it's because again, it's let's help communicate around these things, right? I saw one for space assets, right? So I think it's aerospace has Sparta, and it's like all right, I didn't know that there is that big of a community that needed to know about space threats, but that's kind of cool. And so, like, I don't know, it's really positive to see people trying to communicate and trying to progress together. And hopefully that continues. I know that, like, at least for me, InfoSec Twitter has like died off a lot, unfortunately. But hopefully there's still those sharing communities out there that are just like a community, right? And are all trying to work towards it together.
Yeah, absolutely. So someday it'll be like building a bridge. We will have these years of wealth of information, and this is the best way to think about,
Definitely.
all the different
Love
things.
it. Love it. Yeah. Yeah. Anything we
Well,
can do to help with it, right?
that's right. That's right. Thank you so much, Frank, for coming. It was really interesting discussion. Thanks everybody for attending Defender Fridays. Hopefully, we will see you next week. If you want to get in touch with us, you can also head to our community.limacharlie.io. And yeah, thanks. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.